this subsidy is given by government. Usually it comes with a time limit of approximately. So what happens from a project that say if the project is for 7 years, it will usually take a life of 10 years. 7 years will be falls of project. So what happens is that rate of interest will be say 3%. There is a government subsidy of 15%. 3% is the actual cost of it. But effectively the business is paying for 7 years, the cost of debt remains 13% because of the time lagging cash flow. So which cost of debt is considered?
See there, you may have to take, as the cost of debt is concerned, you have to take 3% cost of debt. That is for 7 years. After 7 years, when there is no subsidy,
No debt, no debt.
sorry?
It will also be over by 7 years.
Okay. In fact, there is another issue which is there in what debt equity you will take. See, normally debt is like a steroid. To some extent, debt is good for the business because debt cost of funds is much lower than the cost of equity. So many times you will find that the business which is coming to you for the valuation, it is entirely funded by equity. Does it mean that debt cash flows will discount only by cost of equity, or you will take a WACC? Now, I believe that we should take WACC because any businessman would like to maximize the return for him. The fact that he has not taken debt today does not stop him from taking debt tomorrow. So either you will convert your equity into debt. That is what some of the companies have done, like Hindustan Lever, they converted their reserves into debentures by giving bonus debenture. Recently, I think Blue Dart has done that. Dr. Reddy's did it in past. Either you will convert your equity into debt, or you will use that equity as a base, borrow further money, and expand your business. So some debt equity always you will consider. So to answer your question, it does not mean that at the end of 7 years you will not have any debt. This particular debt will go away, but some other debt will replace it because always you want to expand the business. And assuming that there is a potential in the business to expand, you will always
fresh capex, fresh debt.
Fresh capex, fresh debt. So as a company, you will have some debt always will be there. But this subsidy scheme, whether it will remain forever or not, we don't know. So then what you will do for 7 years, you will take 3%. After that, you will take a normal cost of debt to arrive at the WACC. And separately, this lag of 1 year lag or 1.5 year, 2 years lag, that separately will be built into the cash flow. Because that subsidy is going to come with a lag.
What is happening that effectively the business is paying for 7 years, it is paying interest at the rate of 30% of the outstanding debt.
Yeah, but if lag is 1 year, actually you are paying only for 1 year. So you have to fund your 1 year interest.
Right.
So the 10% difference you have to fund it only for 1 year. Then it will, roll over. So that separately you consider in the cash flows. But otherwise the cost of debt remains 3% for 7 years. After that, it is an assumption whether government will continue with this scheme or normally you have this in textile companies, you have this kind of schemes, TUFS there, or even in the plantation companies they have. For replanting tea and coffee, government gives subsidy. So those, it will depend on the particular scheme.
Sir, can you throw some light on that lever Vita and unlevered Vita?
Okay. See, lever, this is in theory. In practice, you don't use because these are all complex things, and in reality, it doesn't work. But in theory, the assumption is that a company with a higher debt, the beta on the stock market will be higher, and vice versa. That is a theory. That is where there is a concept of unlevering and relevering the beta. So say today a company has a debt equity ratio of 3 debt and 1 equity. So it is a very high gearing which they have. Their beta is say 1.2, and the company which you are valuing has a debt equity ratio of only say 1:1. So can you apply the beta of 1.2 with a company which has a 3 times debt and 1 equity to a company which has a beta of debt equity of 1:1? So that is where this concept of unlevering and relevering comes in, where you remove the debt impact out of the beta and apply to the debt impact of your company, which is 1:1. In theory, this is what it says. So company higher the debt, higher should be the beta. In reality, it doesn't happen. In stock market, you will find companies which is having a no debt may have a beta which is much higher than the company which has 3 times debt. So in practice, it doesn't work, but in theory, this is the concept of levered beta and unlevered beta. The concept behind that is that when a business goes down, first there is a charge on all the debt providers, because equity is a residual class. So say for example, you talk of a business which is happening in current market, where all the businesses are going down, all the companies are not making profit or they are going into losses. In that case, what will happen? Interest you have to service. So when business is going down, whatever cash flow is generated, more and more money will go in servicing the debt, and very less money will be available for equity shareholders. So those kind of companies will have generally higher beta in the stock market.
You say practically it doesn't work because we take average beta of, we take industry beta. That's why there is no need for levering and unlevering.
Not necessarily. See again, if you want to go little more into details about this, what is a beta? If you know something, beta is you take the past history of the stock market, share price movement on the stock market, vis-a-vis the Sensex. Okay, Sensex or Nifty you take, and you arrive at the beta. What is the significance of past stock market movement to the projections which you are using? Is there a significance? There is no significance. Okay. Second thing, in India, you take out large 200 companies. Other than these 200 companies, even trading in the stock market is not regular. It's they are all thinly traded. Only top 200 or maybe top 300 companies are regularly traded, and there is a good amount of volume. If there is no volume, what kind of beta you are going to get in the stock market? So historical price movement of the share has nothing to do with the projections which you are using. Now, that brings us to another issue. Suppose if you go to a company where MD gives you one set of projections, and MD being a marketing person gives you I'm giving you just an example, nobody will never get to projections, but suppose MD gives you projections which is very, very aggressive. And CFO, like a chartered accountant like us, is very conservative, so he gives a projections here which are conservative. Now in theory, all these things you can calculate. Cost of debt, tax rate, so net of tax, cost of debt you can calculate. In cost of equity, risk-free return beta you can calculate, equity premium you can calculate. In entire this calculation, there is no application of mind required. You need to have understanding of how it is to be calculated, and you need Excel to work out this. So all data is available. Now, if you use this data and that becomes your discount factor, you will end up giving higher value to MD and lower value to CFO, because MD's cash flows are very, very aggressive. Ideally, what you should be doing, if you feel that projections are aggressive, you should be applying the higher discount factor. That factor, where you will bring it? Can you bring it here? You can't. Okay. So all this thing is good in theory. If you have to give exam to pass, you need all these things. But in practice, it doesn't work. So many times you will find that beta of the company is only 0.2. So company's beta is 0.2 and risk return is 8%. 9% is the equity risk premium. The cost of equity becomes 9.8%. 8% plus 9% into 0.2, which is 1.8. So 8 plus 1.8, 9.8% becomes the equity cost of equity. Who is giving you money at 9.8%? Nobody is giving. So this beta, what is thrown in the stock market, is in reality it doesn't work. So many times you come across that you work out the beta and you say that okay, this beta is absurd, so I am using my own beta of 1 or 1.2 or something like that. So in practice, all these things you need to be aware of. Well, it is good in theory, it doesn't work in practice. So suppose if you come across this kind of projections, how will you counter that? There are 3 ways in which you can counter. One is that you say, okay, projections, they have projected X amount of cash flows going forward, and you as a valuer feel that this is very, very aggressive. You knock off 10% of cash flows upfront. The 10% of cash flow is risky. So you knock off only 90% you discount and do the calculation. But that again sometimes doesn't work because management is very sensitive about this. They will say these are all projections. How can you knock off 10% of cash flows? So don't do that. You calculate the entire WACC as per the theory and separately add what is called as a business risk premium. 2%, 3%, something like that you add. And that is your gut feel as a valuer. So to counter that riskiness, you add an extra risk factor. Okay. So this is the way you have to, in reality you have to do the WACC. Otherwise, you will end up giving, you have nothing, there is no application of mind required. Everything can be calculated from the data available. Okay. Any other question on this thing?
So while doing DCF valuation under free cash flow to the firm method, we don't account for interest and inflow and outflow on account of debt.
Correct.
So what we do is we reduce value of debt, present value of debt. So while doing that, should we take the balance sheet, current year's balance sheet debt figure, or should we take debt which is going to be raised in the future discounting value?
No, only current debt is to be taken. Because future debt, which is there is already built it into the cash flow. Because by raising debt, what you do, either you raise debt for capex or you raise debt for the working capital. Both of things are already captured in your calculation. So you can't take future debt, you have to take the current debt.
Then no need of reducing.
No, only reduce the current debt. If you reduce future debt, it becomes double counting. Say for example, today your debt is 20 crores. Next 5 years, debt is expected to go to 100 crores. So the extra 80 crores is going to fund what? Either it is going to fund your working capital or it will fund your capex. Both separately you have taken as outflow. Having already taken as outflow, if you reduce further, it becomes double counting. Correct? So you have to reduce only the current debt.
Second was, if we do mirror shareholding and then we actually we don't do a valuation, we just say that exchange ratio is fair.
There is for demerger.
Not for other things.
No, only in demerger, which I explained, I don't know whether you are there. When there is a...
so can we use that for, if there are merger of two companies, both are having same shareholding, mirror shareholding, can we use such kind of report in that thing?
Yes, you can use. But in that case, valuation is not required.
Okay.
So if say, what he's asking is, suppose if there are two companies where you are doing a valuation for merger, and shareholders of both the companies are exactly same. Not names, but also in terms of percentage holding. So if I am holding say 25% and Vipul Bhai is holding 75% in one company, second company also I am 25%, he is 75%. So whatever swap ratio you give, it is indifferent to us. Because I am going to remain 25%, he is going to remain 75%. In that case, valuation is not required. Whatever ratio you give is fair. In those kind of reports are acceptable.
In income tax department, they will.
See, income tax is not concerned with merger. Entire merger is tax neutral as far as income tax is concerned. This is only for the purpose of shareholders and for the purpose of court. So, as long as it is fair to both, there is no problem. Income tax, as long as you satisfy 21B, then it is a tax neutral. So, for them also they are indifferent.
From abroad. So then what you do is then they would have a cash base to start with their functions. So then how do you?
No, so then it will have a negative cash flow for first 5 years, and entire value will come out of perpetuity.
Entire value. And what if the money is coming in the tranches? Then also you would consider this like if they have 5 projects, we do now, do later. So then that
Then
also.
also, see all these things which are, if it is already contracted and the price is determined, then you need to put in.
Price should be determined and then we should give a higher number of shares.
Like say for example, you get so many cases where say I am putting money, but before that already you have contracted to put money at 20 rupees per share. So now when I am coming in, for me you are a potential diluter. So what rate I should put in, for that purpose I will consider your dilution also, because you are contracted to put in at 20, and assuming value of the company is higher than 20, certainly you will exercise that option. So when I am calculating my value, I will consider you as a potential dilution, and I will put your inflow as in my calculation.
Okay, and if today I include this equity infusion which is coming in and I increase the number of shares on a hypothetical value, is that?
No, you can't do it hypothetical. You have to do it when you know the price. So when you know the amount and you know the price, you also know the number of shares. So that dilution which are contracted, that you can include in the cash flows. Which are not contracted, you don't do it.
And from his question, the debt, when future debt is being raised, do you factor that in your cost of capital?
Yeah, debt you capture. So when you take the debt equity ratio, you don't take current debt equity ratio. You take what is the target debt equity ratio. Like the example which he gave, he said my debt is repaid after 7 years. Does it mean that after 7 years you will have only cost of equity? No. Either you will raise more debt to expand your business, or there is no capacity to expand the business, you will give extra dividend to shareholders and raise some, because some debt is good for the business. So you will take target debt equity.
I didn't understand the startup part when you mentioned negative thing. I didn't understand that.
What she said is that in a startup business, today say a company has a capital of only 1 lakh rupees, but it's an idea and they are going to do some business in future. So initially you will need funds to scale up your business. What we discussed is that if it is not contracted, then we will not include that inflow in the calculation. So when you don't include the inflow in calculation, you include the outflow. Initially you will have negative cash flows for 5 years, or 3 years or 5 years, whatever the negative period is there. So in that case, entire value will come out of perpetuity. Because you are not including the inflow, but you are including the outflow. So initially for 3 years, 5 years, you will have a negative cash flow.
Okay, so you can include the outflows as per the growth assumption and
Yes.
projections you have, but don't include the inflows.
Yeah. And those outflows you can include as long as the current shareholders have capacity to incur that outflow.
Incur as in terms of capex, they don't have that. In terms of money, they don't have it. It is negative only.
No, it's a negative in the company calculation. But in their pocket, they should be able to raise the funds. So for example, if somebody says that I am putting up a project where I need to put say 1,000 crores. And today in my bank account I have only 10 lakhs. Am I capable of doing project with 1,000 crores? No. So then you will not take even capex of 1,000 crores.
But then that's what in startup, if you are planning something that big and the funds are coming, then what do you do? If 10,000 crores are coming in and you cannot do that business without that money, then how do you have it negative and how do you value that business then?
See in reality nobody puts 10,000 crores. It's too much of a big amount.
1 rupees, whatever the amount is.
Yeah. So that is what you need to see, whether the current owners are they capable of putting in that kind of money. So 10,000 crores certainly is a big amount. Say it is not 10,000 crores, it is 5 crores. So then you need to see whether these current owners are capable of putting 5 crores into the business if required.
If they are capable and they are infusing, it is assumed that.
So it is assumed that they are infusing. So, but in actually they are not infusing because that is why you take only the outflow in the calculation. See, what is the DCF? DCF is the present value of future cash flows. Okay. So when I am not
Because somewhere they are getting that turnover, so what would be the value?
correct.
To the extent of outflow, there would be debt and then the equity.
Either it could be debt or it could be promoters' funds, whichever way you take it.
And one more thing, if the projections which are given by the management are very absurd, so as a valuer, how do I justify it or what do I do with it?
So if it is absurd, then you leave the assignment. It's as simple as that. You should be comfortable with the numbers. Ultimately, you have to justify your this thing. While of course, you can put disclaimers and all that into the valuation. But if you feel that something is absurd, then you feel then even wherever it is going to go for scrutiny, they will also feel it's absurd. So then you have to leave the assignment. But by and large, I have seen promoters also, once you tell them in what we call internally as a fear of God, we put fear of God in him. That aisa karega to you will have this problem, that problem. They come in line and they give normal projections. Okay. Any other question on this here?
How do we take the value of beta?
It's not a value of beta. Beta is a number. That is derived from the stock market trading for a particular share. So it's a covariance and variance and all those statistical formulas are there. But now with Excel, there is a formula called slope. SL equal to slope. In that, what you do is, suppose if you want to take 5-year beta for say ITC, you put historical trading daily movement of ITC closing price in that Excel sheet. And see what is the difference in terms of percentage over the previous day. So say one day price was 300, next day it became 306. So it is plus 2%. Then it became 304. So it is minus some number and all. So arrive this for entire 5 years history. Same dates, you take the values of the Sensex or Nifty. And see what is the difference in Sensex or Nifty on those dates. Both these percentage entire line, what you get for ITC and what you get for Sensex, these two you put in a formula called slope on the in the Excel. You will get the beta.
But script wise it is available on the NSE BSE website.
Yeah, but I think they're taking only for Nifty scripts. They don't give all the scripts.
It is available for all the states on NSE website.
It is available NSE? Okay.
Meaning, all the 1,000 stocks.
Okay. Earlier I think it was 50, Nifty 50. Now maybe they are giving for all.
That's absolutely fire value or is capital value.
Plus, this capital line and all those kind of databases are there. They also give, but formula is same. It is a covariance of the share vis-a-vis variance of the overall market. But that again, I don't know whether they are giving for 1 year beta or how much beta they give.
Beta calculation is not available. Price is available. You can download that into CSV.
There is no. So that price I know is available. I am saying even beta also for Nifty 50 they give beta for 1 year.
Yeah, for all the stocks, beta is not available.
Yeah, for Nifty 50 they give 1 year beta. But sometimes you want to use 1 year beta, sometimes you want to use 5 year beta. So then you need to calculate with the slope formula. Yeah, transfer pricing data is also may give because capital line they give the beta. In capital line software, if you have subscribed, they give you get the beta. But otherwise, it is not difficult. You can do it with the slope formula. Any other question on DCF? So all of you are now mastering DCF. Yeah, that I have. See, this is how your normal DCF sheet will work. Of course, I made it very simple. It is not as simple as it looks. You have projections for 5 years. So you start with operating PBT. From this you remove from this you add the interest and depreciation. So what you get is a EBITDA of the total inflows. From this we reduce capital expenditure, incremental working capital, and tax. So your total outflows. Total inflows minus total outflow is the free cash flow. That is calculated for 5 years. Then free cash flow for the last year is used as a base to work out the perpetuity. In this example, I have assumed the growth rate of 3%. So that gives me the capitalized value of perpetuity at 225 crores. The formula for 225 crores is cash flow for 18-19, that is 230 into 103% because 3% is the growth rate, divided by that minus growth rate. So 13.5 minus 3, so 230 into 1.03 divided by 10.5 will give 2257. This is how we do the perpetuity. Now in Excel, if you don't want to do perpetuity, you extend your cash flows for 100 years. So here assumption is that after 1920, the cash flows will grow at 3%. So instead of calculating the perpetuity in your Excel, you extend it for 100 years and increase your cash flows by 3% every year and discount that, you will get the same answer. But this is a shorter version of that, so you calculate the perpetuity. This entire, all this cash flow and the perpetuity is discounted by the discount factor, which is 13.5% in this example. So present value is calculated for each year. Total of all this present value is 186 crores. There is the enterprise value. There is a present value of cash flow for projected period plus perpetuity. From this, you remove loan funds, contingent liability, reference capital, add surplus cash and value of investments. So what you get is the adjusted value for equity shareholders. Those adjustments I will cover general for all the methods subsequently. So adjusted value for equity shareholders you get, that you divide by number of shares, you get per share value. Okay, any questions in this?
So both you do it theoretically or some assumption or estimate?
No, it's a...
Or something?
No, theoretically don't. There is some assumption behind it, but the factors which you will keep in mind One is, we will see what is the growth rate which is projected in next 5 years. Suppose in next 5 years, company has projected growth of 25% year on year. Then you feel that no, even if you achieve this, you are better off. So then don't take any growth for perpetuity. So then you take only 0 or maybe minor growth of 0% or 1% or 2%. But if reasonable growth is projected, then you assume that company will grow at a little higher rate in future. At the maximum growth rate, what we take is around say 5%, or in very exceptional case it is 6%. We will not go beyond that because it is impossible for any company to grow at a higher rate forever. As I explained about Infosys, you can't grow at higher rate forever because of base impact. The base impact will come in. So you consider what is the growth rate, keeping in mind all these factors. Also, growth rate is linked to the WACC. So, say if my WACC is 20%, then whether I reach 3% or 5% doesn't make much difference. But if my WACC is say 10%, then 3% and 5% will make a lot of difference. So it is also in line with the what is the WACC which we are using. So all these parameters together, we need to decide what is the growth rate we want to use for perpetuity.
The research reports can be a different if for some industries they are projected for some years. Whether that can be just taken as a
see, research report will be more useful to you to analyze the projections because there normally they will estimate for next 2-3 years. Now all these analysts also what they do, they don't do everything on their own. They also contact management and management gives them some input. So that will give you some sense about the projections. But it is more of to analyze the projections, not much about the growth rate to use in perpetuity. Because all these research reports normally they work on the multiple methods. They don't use DCF as such. Yeah, so then you start with operating PBT, don't add the interest, because then interest is already part of PBT cost, so interest cost is covered. Then everything else is the same. No, don't add the interest, everything else is the same, but separately you need to add the inflow of loan and outflow of loan. But then your discount rate will be cost of PBT, it will not be paid. But that as I said, free cost of equity in very few cases we use, especially when it is an entire project you know that this is how the project is going to be funded. Okay. So
Calculating the terminal value, if free cash flow for last will it be 18?
sorry?
Calculating the terminal value.
No, it should be 1920. I have taken 1920, only there is a typo error in the left side.
Because once I have seen a DCF where the company had considered one in this probably must be 89 for calculating a terminal value. Is that correct?
See, ideally you need to, in fact, this again, because it's a seminar, I can't go into much of detail. Ideally you need to separately calculate the cash cost for terminal value. In the sense, say for example, say here, your incremental working capital is 6 crores. Okay, and your total inflows, that is EBITDA, has from 39 crores has gone to 42 crores. Okay, so there is a 10% growth. Assume 10% growth is in the sales, 10% growth is in the EBITDA. Okay, so margin is remaining constant. Now, the growth rate what I take for perpetuity should be linked to my business. Say for example, if I say that I want to take 0% growth rate, so there is no growth. I am better off what I have achieved in last year, I will continue that, I am better off. In that case, if my business is continuing on the same level, I don't need any working capital. So working capital of 6 crores has to be removed. If I am say expecting that I am going to grow only at 3%, my working capital should increase only by 3%. But in the last year, because my business grew by 10%, ideally my working capital also would have grown by 10%. So when we actually do, you need to also do, as I said, this is very simple I made, but in reality you need to do much more detail about all these factors. So working capital has to be changed. The capex you may have to change, because capex for perpetuity, again you need capex for growth as well as capex for maintenance. It is possible that last year 1920 there is no capex, but still you will need capex for future. So So all these factors you need to separately calculate for perpetuity value, entire cash flow, and then capitalize it. Here I have made it a little simple.
This surplus fund is estimated.
No, this is not estimated. This is on the balance sheet date. See, what we are doing is, suppose today, if you take the balance sheet, you have all the liabilities and the assets, and there is a fixed deposit of say 20 crores, or in this example, around 12 crores. Okay, so 12 crores is actually not required for my business. What I have taken cash flow is the future business cash flow, which gives me present value of cash which I will generate in future. Then what happens to the cash which I have today? So that I have to add separately. But why the word surplus is used? Because there is some cash which is required in business. To the extent cash is required in the business, that becomes part of working capital, and that is not available for shareholders. So only it is possible that company's balance sheet cash will be say 15 crores. I assume 3 crores is required for business, and 12 crores I have added. Okay, can we go ahead now, or any other questions on DCF? Now we go to the other earnings method, which is commonly used method is market cap to PAT. It is a PECV method, or enterprise value to EBITDA multiple method, and third is a sales multiple method, but which I said more it is used for cross check other than the actual method, because business is done to earn the profits and not for the sales. So these are the commonly used method, and sales multiple is more used as a cross check. So when you use the enterprise value to EBITDA method, you need to determine the maintainable EBITDA, you need to determine the multiple what we need to use, and EV to EBITDA method is not affected by the pattern of funding adopted by the company or a comparable companies. So here what you do is, both these methods, you need to arrive at what is the future maintainable profit. So in case of a PECV, you want to arrive at a future maintainable PAT and apply a PE multiple to that, or in case of EV EBITDA method, arrive at a future maintainable EBITDA and apply EV EBITDA multiple to arrive at the enterprise value. So on both these methods, you need to arrive at a future maintainable profit. So the maintainable earnings, what you arrive, is based on the past performance or future projections, or it could be combination of past and future. So either if say company is an operating company, like say for example if I want to value Hindustan Lever. Hindustan Lever is an operating company, it has generated good amount of profit in the past, then I can use the past 3 years profit as a base to arrive at a maintainable profit. I don't need to go into future. But some companies say they have incurred losses in the past for some reason, but now they are expected to make profit, then I can use projections. Or I can use combination of past and the future, say 1 year past and 2 future, or 2 past and 1 year future. So either of that you can do it to arrive at the maintainable profit. Now when you take the profits, what you want to arrive at is the operational profit. So all the items which are non-operating in nature, those items you need to remove, or the items which are non-recurring in nature you need to remove. So what are the items of non-operating nature? Suppose if I am valuing say Tata Chemicals. Now Tata Chemicals is in the business of soda ash, plus it is in the business of fertilizer. Okay. In all these years, whatever funds they have generated, they have invested these funds into various Tata Group companies, and they are getting dividend out of those investments. So investment, the dividend is a non-operational income for them. It has nothing to do with operations. It's a non-operational. I don't want to apply multiple to that. So I remove the dividend income which the company has got from various investments. Similarly, there could be some interest income which they would have got, or there could be one-time item like profit on sale of assets or profit on sale of investment, or loss on sale of asset or loss on sale of investments. All those items has to be excluded. Now, let us take example of this, what we were discussing about Nestle. Now, Nestle, because of this issue, what has happened? Suppose if you want to value Nestle today, what you will do? You will, all this expenditure which they are going to incur on taking back the inventory and write-off of the inventory will become the one-time expenditure. So that you need to, you cannot assume that this kind of issues will happen every year. If it happens every year, then it will be out of business. So this becomes a one-time, expenditure. Earlier, if you know, in Cadbury, some bombs were found before few years. So at that time, like Nestle, what is they are following, they are encountering today. Cadbury also went through the same issues. That bombs were found and people said Cadbury is not good for human consumption and all those issues came up. So similarly, like Nestle, they also called back all the inventory and all inventory was written off. So the inventory write-off becomes a one-time item of you don't assume these things will happen every year. Now because of this particular incident, Cadbury had to launch, they roped in Mr. Amitabh Bachchan to advertise about Cadbury, that Cadbury is safe. Internally they called this as a Project Vishwas. They wanted to regenerate the Vishwas of the consumers. So whatever advertisement expenditure incurred on the Project Vishwas also becomes a one-time item. Like Cadbury as a FMCG company, they will be doing advertisement. So entire advertisement doesn't become one time, but what is incurred for Project Vishwas becomes one-time item. So that again you need to add it back. Third thing, because of this incident, earlier it was a loose packing. Now it is a packed. The Cadbury comes in a packed packing. So the extra packaging cost which you will incur, which was not there in the past, but now it will be there in future. So that has to be subtracted. So if I am taking that particular year as a profit, I will add back inventory write-off, I will add back extra expenditure on Project Vishwas, but I will reduce the extra packaging cost which I need to incur in future. So even if that say 5 paise per Cadbury, 5 paise into volume, that becomes my extra expenditure. So all these adjustments I need to do it because of one incident. I'll give you another example. There was a terrorist attack on hotels, Indian Hotel and Oberoi in Mumbai. Now because of that, there will be again various adjustments which we will have to do. One is that whatever expenditure they have incurred on restoring the hotels, you need to add it back. Because you don't assume that these things will happen every year. So whatever expenditure they incur, you need to add it back. Second is, this incident happened on 26th of November. And for hotel industry, the last quarter is the best quarter. There is a lot of foreigners come. So, one is they lost profit on this hotel, from these hotels, specifically in Mumbai and Trident, because in Mumbai, Taj and Trident, because they were shut. But also a lot of foreigners, they cancelled their visit to India. So not only these two hotels, but across the country, all the hotels were impacted because of this. So the loss of profit also has to be adjusted and added back. But at the same time, because of this incident, the security cost has increased forever. Like earlier when you were going to the hotel, there was the scanners are not required. Now you go to any 5-star hotel, you need scanners. So that security cost has incurred forever. It is increased forever. So if I am taking Indian hotels as the base, I will add back the cost which is incurred to restore the hotels. I will also add back the loss of profit, but I will reduce the security cost which I need to incur forever. That is how I arrive at the maintainable profit. It is possible that after doing all this, I find that current year profit, even after doing this adjustment, is not representative. Because I may not be able to do all these adjustments in totality. So if that is what I find, then I ignore this year. Because I said this entire year is abnormal and non-recurring. So I ignore this year and I use maybe previous other 2 years or 3 years to arrive at my maintainable profit. So any incident like this, you need to see how it can impact your profitability, and accordingly you need to make adjustment to arrive at the maintainable profit.
There will be some impact on the profitability of the company in days becoming applicable. On in days becoming applicable from 1/4 to next year, 16 and 17.
See, there what happens in case of this kind of when there is a change across the industry, especially in the accounting estimates or where you account your this thing. Those adjustments are there in your company, also in the comparable companies. So to that extent, your multiple takes care of those kind of adjustments. But if these kind of things are material in nature, then you may have to give a thought to that. But that I am not able to recollect an example like this. Of course, in change of in the DCF method, all these things will not have any impact, because cash flow is not linked to any gap. Cash flow is a cash flow. Whether you do it under Indian GAAP or Ind AS or you do it under IFRS or US GAAP, net cash has to remain constant. It cannot change, irrespective of whatever GAAP you are applying.
To the extent of depreciation, yes.
No, everything. Because you start with profit, so your profit is higher or lower, and to that extent depreciation is higher and lower. So net cash flow what you generate here, the free cash flow item, this is not dependent on any gap. All these adjustments, the numbers which are above will change, whether it is Indian gap or US gap. But free cash flow cannot change because free cash flow is the actual cash which is generated. And cash is cash, it is not dependent on any gap. So cash flow will not have impact, but yes, in profitability companies, in profitability, these methods it will have impact. But that you have to see, how important their difference is. And also if the difference is across the industry, multiple will take care of that.
And in the first year of implementation, there will be impact more one-time items will be there, and then going forward there will not be one-time items. So
yeah, but it will be there in your company also, it will be there in other companies. So elimination of material, all non-recurring or non-operating items, you need to eliminate. Suppose if any adjustment, if capacity is underutilized or recently added, you need to adjust. So I'll take the same example of the cement companies. Suppose earlier it was 2 million ton, and recently they have added another 2 million ton plant. So if I take past as the base, my past is based on 2 million ton, whereas my future is going to be 4 million ton. So I cannot take past as my base to arrive at the future value. So I need to adjust my past for 2 million to 4 million ton, and then do the calculation. So any change in the capacity, or if capacity is underutilized, I need to give impact of that. And then profits of various years, other than taking a profit of a particular year, you want to take profit of the various years to average the profits and arrive at the maintainable profit. Any questions on this? Now after once you arrive at the maintainable profit, then another important number here is the multiple. What is the multiple you want to apply to those to the maintainable profit? So multiple to be applied to represent the growth prospects or expectation of the company. Factors to be considered while deciding the multiple is past and expected growth of the earnings, performance of the company vis-a-vis the peers, size and the market share, historical multiple enjoyed on the stock market exchange by the company and its peers. So these are all the factors which you will keep in mind when you want to arrive at the multiple. Now I'll give you some example. This all these government banks. What is the multiple at which they are traded normally? 4 to 5 times of their PAT. And what is this private sector banks are traded? 18, 19, 20 times. Maybe not 18, 20, but say 14 to 15 times. Okay. So why there is a difference? Same, all the banks are competing in the same market. All the banks are borrowing funds from us at around 8 to 8.5%. All the banks are lending to the same customers. But private government sector banks are traded at 4 to 5 times. And private sector banks are traded at 15 times, 12 to 15 times or 18. Some banks even at 18 times. Why there is a difference in the multiple?
Efficiency and physical MPH. Basically growth rate. The growth rate to the efficiency.
Yeah. See, one of the important aspects is the growth rate. What is the growth rate which these banks are giving? Also, when investors, they are when investors give the value, they also see what is the kind of management which they have. Like say, for example, if you take HDFC Bank, which is one of the good private sector bank, almost for last decade or so, the profit grows at 30% per year. Whatever may happen, the profit will grow at 30% per year. I think this year there was little reduction, but otherwise 30% is the norm for them. Whereas you see public sector banks, some years they will grow, some years they will, the profits will be lower. Mr. Aditya Puri, who is the MD of HDFC Bank, is there since last maybe 20-25 years. Whereas chairman of public sector banks changes once every year or once in 2 years. So there is no continuity of the top person. So each chairman comes and he changes the entire structure of the bank, the way banks give the loans, the way bank do the business or the products which they come out. It keeps on changing. So that is where public sector banks, they are not able to grow at the same rate as the private sector bank. Another important aspect of private sector banks is that they have learned at the cost of public sector banks. Whatever mistakes public sector banks made in the past, private sector bank got advantage of that, and they are ensuring that they don't repeat those mistakes. And again, because they are new banks, they are more on the technology driven. The technology is much better than the public sector banks. So all these factors are reflecting in the multiple of the on the stock market. So when investor is giving the value, investors will look at all these aspects and then decide what is the multiple to be given for a particular company. So when we do the valuation, that is what you need to do. You need to see what is the multiple which is enjoyed by the company, what are the peers and what is the multiple which are enjoyed by them, and then decide the value. Say for example, if I am doing a valuation of Infosys, which are the comparable companies which I will take? Maybe I will take TCS, I will take Wipro. But suppose if I am valuing some small software company, can I take Infosys multiple as a comparable? Certainly not, because the size, the kind of profit, its kind of management is going to be different. The kind of products which the company offers, Infosys may offer all the products in IT, whereas that small company could be in a niche market. So it cannot get the same multiple. But sometimes if that niche is so niche, it may even get higher multiples than Infosys. So that is also possible. So all these factors you need to keep in mind when you want to decide the multiple. So this is how your EV to EBITDA multiple the sheet will look like. You will have in this example, I have taken profits for last 3 years. These are all adjusted EBITDA. So 18 crores for 12-13, 25 crores for 13-14, and 31 crores for 14-15. I have given higher weight to the current year because that is the normally what we do. We give highest weight to the current year. So I have given weight of 1, 2, and 3. So maintainable EBITDA works out to 27 crores, which is total of 161 crores divided by 6. To this, in this example, I have given multiple of 7. You need to see what is the multiple, which is the comparable companies are enjoying in the market. So what I get is the capitalized value or the enterprise value. From this, loan fund is reduced, reference capital is reduced, value of investment is added, contingent liability is reduced, and surplus funds are added. So I get a per share value. I get a total value of 180 crores divided by number of shares. I get a per share value. Now, this is EV/EBITDA method. Similarly, you can do a PECV method, where instead of maintainable EBITDA, you arrive at a maintainable PAT and apply the PE multiple. All these adjustments will be the same except the loan funds, because in a PE multiple method, interest is already taken as a cost. So then loan funds doesn't come into the calculation. Other than that, all adjustments will be there in the PECV method. Next method is the market price method. This is the simplest method if you have to do the valuation, because if the shares are listed, then data is available on the stock market. So it evaluates the value on the basis of the prices quoted in the stock exchange. But you have to be careful for thinly traded or dormant script where there is a low floating stock, because the market price may not represent the true worth of the share of the company. Or if there are significant and unusual fluctuations in the market price, again you have to be careful. So either you ignore those years, those days, and or take an average of a longer period. Let's say for example, Unitech. Before 2 days it was trading at somewhere around 13-14 rupees. Just in one day it came to 8 rupees. Now, does it mean that the value of the Unitech is 8 rupees? Yeah, maybe yes, maybe no. We don't know what will happen in future. But if you are doing a valuation of Unitech, certainly you can't take average of 14 and 8 and say the value is 9. You need to go into much into detail. What is the reason behind it going down by 40% in one day? Does it again come back to the normal number, or it remains at this number for a longer period? What are the factors behind this? All these things you have to keep in mind when there is a significant fluctuation in the market price. Otherwise, if shares are traded normally and they go along with the market, you take the normal weighted average market price. So normally we take 6 months average market price rather than taking a particular day's market price. And regulatory bodies are also comfortable taking average of some market price, like for preferential allotment or buyback or takeover code. Each formula has a different calculation method, but everybody talks of some average of few days. Some is 60 days, some is last 2 weeks, and so on and so forth.
So, if you buyback, it is thinly traded and government trading is government script, then what happens?
Then, as per the SEBI formula, market price is not relevant. Then the SEBI guideline says you go as per the other parameters like the book value and PE method and all that. So then again you go back to our other methods. And see, buyback again, what happens is that if it is not a compulsory buyback, it is not extinguishment in that sense, then it's an option to the shareholder whether he wants to surrender the shares or not.
When it is delisting,
No, even in delisting, it's an option to the shareholder. It is not compulsory. But if it is a compulsory squeeze out, then yes, valuation is very important, which I, in fact I will cover in the Cadbury case. But otherwise, you need to apply the other methods. The asset method, in the PECB method, in those kind of methods you will apply. That is what SEBI guidance is. Now, if shares of the company are not listed, then you will apply what is called as market comparables. So generally it is applied in case of unlisted entities. Estimates value by relating an element with underlying element of a similar listed company. So say suppose if I am valuing a company which is in aluminum business and this company is not listed, I will consider, I will see what is the multiple which is enjoyed by Hindalco or Nalco or any other aluminum company, what is the multiple at which they are traded. Then I need to see that how does my company compare with those companies. So say maybe Hindalco and Nalco are very large companies, so they are trading at a multiple of 8 times of the EBITDA, but my company is not that large. So I think there I need to apply the discount. How much that discount, again it's a valuer's judgment. But certainly some discount needs to be applied. So all those factors I will keep in mind when I decide the multiple which I want to apply for unlisted company. So it could be based, and also it could be based on the market multiple of like a book value multiple, which is very common in valuing bank and the NBFCs. So they are always one of the important factors for banks and NBFC is the what is the price to book value multiple. So normally if you see this government banks, they are traded at a price to book value of around 0.5 to 0.7, except SBI, which is always traded at a higher than the book value, whereas private sector banks are traded at much more than the book value. Then any industry specific multiples or multiples from any recent M&A transactions, those things you need to also are useful parameters for you to decide the multiple what you want to do. One thing which I will tell you that when you are doing a valuation from this, I will give you the example of this cash in. There, which yesterday this Imami has acquired. Right? So what we know is that transaction price is 1.1650 crores and turnover is 300 crores. We don't know other parameters. What is the profitability and all that. So does it mean that all these companies which are into haircare business should be traded at 5.5 times of the sales? Answer is no, it could be no, because all the companies may not have the same kind of profitability. So ideally you should get the multiple of the profitability. Even if you get the multiple of profitability, you don't know what is the actual deal. I will give you an example. I was involved in a deal where say current year profit was 50 crores, next year estimated profit was 100 crores. And the deal was that next year's profit into 8 times is the value, enterprise value. That was the deal between both the parties. And I was aware because I was party to the deal. I was there involved in the deal for all the negotiation and everything. But somehow it happened that current year actual profit was half of next year, projected of next year. So when it was announced, all these analysts, what they said, oh, this company, this industry transaction took place at 16 times of EBITDA. And it's absurd. But then all the promoters, they said, oh, 16 times of EBITDA, it is very, very good number and all that. But in reality, it is not 16 times of current EBITDA, it is 8 times of next year EBITDA. And in the deal, there was a clause that if next year, if 100 is not achieved, and if it is 80, 8 times will be applied on 80 and not 100. So there was an adjustment clause in the deal, but all these things will not be in public domain. So when you take data from this kind of transactions, if you are not involved in the transaction, you may get carried away. Especially when you see this kind of multiple. I am sure even in Cash King, there will be some underlying negotiations will be there. But because we don't have the data, we say okay, 5.5 times of the sales. But in reality, it may not be like that. So you have to be always careful when you take data from this, public information. So this is how the calculation of market price method will work. You will have turnover for. So in this, I have taken 6 months average market price. So 6 months turnover is put and volume is put for 6 months. The total of turnover divided by total of volume will give you per share value. And all this data is available, in the stock market website. The third method is, we discussed about the earnings method, we discussed about the market method. Third is the asset method. So there, either you do book value, which is the NAV, or you do a replacement value. So NAV, either you go under asset approach or liability approach. So in asset approach, total asset minus liabilities will give you the net asset value. Or share capital plus reserves minus miscellaneous expenditure and debit balance in P&L will give you net asset value. So the working of NAV will look like this. It's a net fixed asset plus investments plus deferred tax asset plus current assets, net current asset minus loan funds will give you net asset value. From this, appreciation in value of investment is added, contingent liability is reduced. I'll discuss about all these adjustments. Reference capital is reduced, provided the adjusted net asset. Divide by number of shares, you will get per share value.
Deferred tax asset.
Sorry?
What about deferred tax asset? Deferred tax asset.
Deferred tax asset, if it is there, you take it. It is there.
Is it an asset actually?
It's asset. Then only you recognize. Otherwise, why you recognize? Deferred tax asset is asset. Deferred tax liability is also liability. So whatever it is there, you need to take it. In fact, here in this example, deferred tax asset is recognized. But if you go as per AS 22, you recognize deferred tax asset only if it is by virtual certainty backed by convincing evidence. So in so many cases, you will find that deferred tax asset is not recognized. But then separately, you will recognize in your calculation, even though it is not recognized in the balance sheet. Because NAV is never done on a standalone basis. NAV is done along with other methods. In other methods, if you are saying, assuming that the company is going to make profit in future, then you will utilize those deferred tax asset. So even if it is not recognized, you will recognize in your calculation. Now we come to the common adjustments, which we of course have discussed, but I'll discuss the individual items. Now investments. Investments are normally surplus, because whatever net worth, whatever profit you generate, some of that you put into the some investments. Whether it is a equity shares or it is some mutual funds or any other investments. So these investments are normally surplus in nature. So you need to value this investment based on the current realizable value or current market value. Like I'll give you the same example of Tata Chemicals. In their balance sheet, they have 10,000 shares of Tata Sons, and cost in their books is 57 crores. What is the worth of these 10,000 shares of Tata Sons? Is anybody's guess. It could be worth even 30 lakhs, 50 lakhs per share. So 57 crores, which is the cost in the books, is in reality is going to be much higher in terms of worth. So if I am valuing shares of Tata Chemicals, I cannot deprive the shareholders of Tata Chemicals of the underlying value which they sit in the shares of Tata Sons. The Tata Sons holds 74% of TCS. So you take market cap of TCS, 70% of that belongs to Tata Sons. Plus Tata Sons has all other investments in various Tata Group companies. There's a lot of businesses which are within the Tata Group, Tata Sons, and they are as a division. So all those things you need to value it. So 57 crores, which is the cost in the books of Tata Chemical. Say the fair value of those 57 crores is 10,000 crores. Then 9,943 crores becomes the surplus. So that I need to add separately in the value. Okay, is this concept clear?
First you need to value the shares of Tata Sons.
Yeah, you need to value the shares of Tata Sons. Luckily, if you are valuing any Tata Group companies, they give you what is the per share value of Tata Sons, because they get it valued every year. But suppose if they are holding shares in Tata Tea, Tata Tea again is a listed, so you take market price and compare with the cost and work out the appreciation. Yes.
But they are taking other assets at par value.
Sorry?
They are taking other assets at par value.
Other assets at book value.
Book value.
Yeah. So
but
only
in the investment you are taking at 3% value.
Yeah, because investment is surplus in nature. Let's say, for example, if company has a land, the next item is surplus asset. What is a surplus asset? It is any asset which is there in the company but not used for its operations. This is surplus. So say, for example, company has a manufacturing facility. It has a total land of 300 acres. Out of 300 acres, the manufacturing facility is on 75 acres. So 75 acres is not surplus for me. It is required for my business. And profit out of that I am taking separately. So I will not take 75 acres value. But the 225 acres, if it is separable and sellable, then I need to add separately. Because in my profit, I have not taken any income which is coming out of these 225 acres. Today I can sell these 225 acres, realize the money, still I will continue to earn the profits what I am getting otherwise. So that item becomes a surplus asset. You need to value that. Yes, yes. Sometimes it happens that to value one company, you have to value 10 other companies.
Then investment companies are located at a very less rate. Like so many companies, ECFC or even Unifoods, all that, they are holding in United Console and all. The value is too huge. The share is floating at just 25, 30, 25.
Yeah.
So how one should look at it?
See, there is a concept of holding company discount. So why these companies are quoting at such a discount? Because
They will never sell.
they will never sell. There is one thing. Second is, whatever income they are getting in terms of dividend, again the promoter will decide how you want to utilize those funds. So generally you will see that all these companies, which are holding companies, to its true value, they are traded at a discount of anywhere between 30% to 80%. Like if you go to this Tata Investment Corporation, every year when they give their result, they also say that what is the fair value of their share. If you take what I am explaining about taking all the assets at market value. So I think in the recent result they have said that fair value of Tata Investment Corporation is around 1,000 rupees per share, whereas market price is 550. So to its intrinsic value, market price is 45% discount. Now 45% discount actually is a reasonably good discount. Because there are some other companies that listed at around 80% discount. Because those companies may not be, investment companies may not be giving dividend to the shareholders. So ultimately as a shareholder what you get? You are clueless. Why, when this Pyramids, they sold their pharma business, why there was even cry? Because cash did not come to the shareholders, cash went into the company. And promoter will decide how that cash has to be used. So all the investors were not happy with that deal. Because cash doesn't come to the shareholders, cash remains in the company. You have control over, as a shareholder, you can only vote in the holding company, but you don't have control over the subsidiary. So that is why there is a discount. See, it's a no. If they merge that holding company into subsidiary, like what this is what Reliance Enterprises does.
ACFC, they are holding all public listed companies. So there is no compulsion, but still it is putting at 20, and its value is much higher. No,
yeah, but then see but as an investor, what you will get? Are they going to?
Even if they just liquidate all the investment, they get 80 to 90 crores. And even if they distribute, you get much more than the third.
Correct, certainly you will get. When the company is traded at 30% of its true worth, that balance 70%, even after paying all the dividend distribution tax and all, there is a huge appreciation. The question is whether they will actually do it. They may sell all those assets, but they will not distribute dividend. Then what will you do?
But then they have to do something with the cash.
That cash, they will keep it just with them. They will just give 1 rupee per share as a dividend. See, in fact, there is a totally separate discussion whether you should be investing in stock market or not. No. Like say for example, Reliance Industries. When you are buying 100 shares on the stock market, do you get say in the management of the company? You don't get. You are at the mercy of Mukesh Ambani. So there is a separate discussion whether you should be investing in a stock market.
Sir, how do you determine the holding company discount?
No, you don't determine. That is market determines. So market, like say in his example, he said that worth of the company is 90 crores, and today it is say traded at 30 crores. Then holding company discount is 66%.
No, but in a case which is thinly traded, or it is almost a normal, but just for the sake of listing, it has been listed. Then what happens?
No, then there is no holding company discount. Holding company is a company which doesn't have business on its own. It holds investment in another company. That is called as holding company.
Yeah, then what discount would you apply?
So that is what I am saying. If you see the market, it ranges anywhere between 40% to 80%. So you need to decide depending on your case. Like say there is one company called Bamar Lorry Investment. That holds shares in Bamar Lorry. Okay. But that company, whatever dividend they get from Bamar Lorry, they pass it on to shareholders of Bamar Lorry Investment. So their dividend yield is very good. So their discount is less. But companies which don't give dividend, their discount will be high because there is no incentive for shareholder to buy the shares. So surplus assets we discussed. Then auditors qualification, if auditors have qualified something, you need to adjust in the valuation. Preference shares is a part of the net worth as far as Companies Act is concerned, but when we are valuing equity shares, preference shares is a liability, so we need to reduce. ESOPs and warrants are potential dilution instruments. So if they are in the money, you need to remove, you need to adjust. If they are out of the money, you ignore. So say if ESOP is given to be exercised at say 50 rupees per share, and current market price is 100, then all the option holders are going to exercise. But if current market price is 20, then nobody is going to exercise. So if it is in the money, you adjust. Out of the money, you ignore. Contingent liabilities are disclosed in the accounts, but they are potential drag on the net worth or the cash flows of the company. So there you need to estimate what is the contingent liabilities, how much of that is going to materialize, and that you adjust. If company has any tax concessions, then again you need to see how you want to value. Say for example, there are this ATI benefit and all that. Those are there for a limited period. So that you will value a limited period. But there are certain tax concessions like you have R&D expenditure, you get extra 100% reduction. Some section is there in income tax. I am not good in income tax. So those you assume that those will be permanent. So in those companies you take the tax rate at a lower rate. Otherwise you take a tax rate at a normal marginal rate and separately add the value of tax benefit for the remaining period of your life. If you are doing a valuation for acquisition and any financial DDR is done, any adjustment which is coming out of those DDR also you need to adjust in your valuation.
Sir, some net assets and what you said that if it is in the money, now based on the valuation we derive a value per share. Let's say it's 50. So that 50 will act as a reference number, whether it is in the money.
Yeah, but if share is listed, then you need to also see the what is the market price. It is possible that share is listed at 20, but you are getting a value of 50. A shareholder or option holder is going to decide from the market price, not based on your valuation. But yes, otherwise you will take that also into account. Now I just tabulated what are the methods which one can use in some industries like knowledge-based companies, earnings and market can be used. For manufacturing companies, earning, market and asset can be used. Grant-driven companies, earnings and market. A mature company, again earning and market. Investment or property companies, only asset can be used. Company going for liquidation, again asset can be used. In general, market approach is used in combination with other methods. There is a cross check. Now, when you do the valuation, you give the report. You need to come to a recommendation. So, when you use multiple methods, each method will throw a different number. So, you need to arrive at some average. Either you do a mathematical weightage or you give some weight to a particular method, higher weight or lower weight, and arrive at a average value. So, ultimately, it is going to be a professional judgment and subjective evaluation. Now, there are other value drivers which are beyond these methods. So, final value, what you give. There are other value drivers like strategic positioning of the company, or there is a concept of illiquidity discount. When I am valuing a unlisted share, a buyer of unlisted share does not get ready market. So, there is a concept of discount for illiquidity. So, suppose if I am using the multiples of a listed share, I cannot apply the same multiple to unlisted share because there is no liquidity. So either I discount the multiple itself or I discount the value. Either of it I can do it. Then there is a premium for emerging market. There is also alternate opportunities. So as an investor, if you don't want to, if you have money, then money you can use it in any company. So you always will see what is the alternate opportunities you have, and then you will decide whether you want to invest in that company or not. Then distress sale, again there is a discount because if somebody is in a distress sale, he wants to get rid of the company, so he may offer a discount. Another important aspect is the control premium. So, like in India, moment you cross 25%, there is some control premium is paid because moment you cross 25%, other person cannot pass a special resolution without your permission. When you cross 50%, good amount of premium is paid because by just acquiring one share more than 50%, you get majority of the company and you decide how the company has to be run. So by acquiring 51%, you control 100% cash of the company. There is a discount of, there is a concept of control premium, and at 50%, there is a good premium which is paid. Again, when you cross 75%, you could pay good premium because then you can pass special resolution, other person cannot, object to it. And finally, when you want to reach 100%, there is a good premium is paid because you want to get rid of the nonsense value or the nuisance value of the minority shareholders. So again, you pay a premium there. So these are all other value drivers which are there. And to see the last line, final price is the result of negotiation between the buyer and the seller. So whatever we have done or we discussed, ultimately it is left to the parties to decide the transaction. So say Vipulbhai and Paras are doing the deal, and I do valuation of 100 rupees, and somebody gives value of 200 rupees. They are free to do the deal at either 50 rupees or at 1000 rupees. Because it is for them to decide what is the rate at which they want to do the deal. So ultimately, the king is the person who are doing the deal. And we are just helping them to arrive at the some numbers. Now, when you go to the valuation for mergers, here what is important is the relative value and not the absolute values. So, say for example, when I am valuing a company, when I am doing a valuation for merger, and A company is merging into B, I can value company A at 100, company B at 100, and my swap ratio is 1:1. So every one share of company A, I will give you one share of company B. At the same time, I can value company A at 90, company B also at 90, still my swap ratio is 1:1. So what is important in case of a merger valuation is the relative values and the swap ratio and not the absolute values. Okay. I can value both the companies at 100 or value both the companies at 50 in theory. Still my ratio is 1:1. So I want to then say, because in merger I don't give the per share value. What I say that for X shares of company A, you will get Y number of shares of company B. So what is important is the relative values and not the absolute values. So the exchange ratio is simply the number of transferring company shares that are to be issued to the shareholders of transferor company as a consideration for the merger. So to tabulate the merger valuation, say I value company A and company B, and these are all per share value. Net asset method under company for company A is 28 rupees per share. EV/EBITDA method with earning method is 72 and market price is 63. Company B, it is NAV 30, earnings 42 and market price is 43. Normally I will give weight of 1, 2 and 2 because market price higher weight is given. When you see give 1, 2 and 2, we are giving 40% to market, 40% to earnings and 20% to asset. Why higher weight of 40% is given to market? Because people are actually putting money at that price. So when their transactions are taking place, it should get higher weightage. Similarly, business is done to earn profits. So earnings also should get the higher weightage. So earnings also gets equal weightage of 40%. In asset, you can't totally ignore. So you don't give higher weightage, but you give a lower weightage of 20%. So this is where the concept of 1, 2 and 2 or 20, 40, 40 comes in. Now depending on the company what you are valuing, you need to decide whether you will use all the three methods. Like normal manufacturing companies, for merger you will use all the three methods. But suppose if you are doing a merger of Infosys and TCS, then NAV doesn't make any difference. Technically Infosys and TCS, they don't need any assets. All their assets, they can take it on hire. For them, what are the assets? These are human resources. They can take all computers on hire, they can take all building, everything on hire. Still they can earn what they are earning. So in those companies, asset value is not significant, it's not important. So if you are doing a merger for Infosys and TCS, maybe you will give zero weight to the asset method and you will use only earnings and market method. Okay. Now very briefly I will cover some judicial pronouncements. Of course, tomorrow Anup is going to cover in detail. So one is this exchange ratio. There is a Mir Mohammadlal case in Dinesh Lakhani where it says exchange ratio is not disturbed by the courts unless it is objected and found grossly unfair. So courts, they have taken a view, they are like umpires in a cricket match. They have to give their decision only if somebody appeals. If nobody appeals, then court is not going to suo moto, comment on the valuation. So they have taken a position that we are not expert in valuation. So it is left to the experts who are in the valuation. Now, second is an English judgment, which actually summarizes the valuation is more like an art. It says valuation will take into account number of factors such as prospective yield, marketability, the general outlook for the types of business of the company, etc. Mathematical certainty is not demanded, nor indeed it is possible. So it says that it is more like an art and not as a science. And this is a Hindustan Lever case, which is that it is fair to use combination of three well-known methods. There is asset value, yield value, and market value. This was in the case of merger of Tomco with Hindustan Lever. And in these three methods were used. And court said for a merger valuation, it is a fair way of looking at it. After that, whichever mergers have been challenged, there Hindustan Lever judgment is taken as the base. So it is more like a Bible for doing the valuation. In fact, SEBI also for takeover code, if the shares are thinly traded, they will ask the companies to get the valuation as per the Hindustan Lever judgment. So there you use combination of these three methods to arrive at the value. So this is end of my presentation. I have one more the Cadbury case I want to discuss for 5 minutes. This Cadbury, I'll just give you some background. Cadbury is a case where there is a compulsory squeeze out by the company. So, earlier, all the companies, when they do delisting and they do buyback and all that, but they are never able to achieve 100%. Because there are some shareholders who have either lost the shares or maybe those persons are not in existence. So, and nobody in the family is aware that this person was holding these shares. So, you will find those shareholders. Plus, there are some shareholders who want to always keep the shares. They never want to sell. So, companies are not able to achieve 100%. So there was a company called Sandvik Asia, which said that we want to squeeze out, remove all the shareholders. And they went with a scheme to the Bombay High Court under capital reduction under the Companies Act, and they went to the court for the approval. Now the single judge allowed the compulsory squeeze out. That yes, a company can remove the shareholders by giving them the fair value. Then some shareholders went to division bench. Division bench overruled the single judge judgment. They said no, company cannot force the shareholders to go out. So company went to Supreme Court. In Supreme Court ultimately allowed that yes, company can squeeze out the shareholders as long as they give the fair value. So technically now, as the law stands today, company can squeeze out the minority shareholders by giving them the fair value. The fact that you can squeeze out is not in question. So now the only question which arises is whether the value which is given, is it a fair value or not? Because now squeeze out is allowed by Supreme Court. So Cadbury was, after Sandvik Asia, a lot of companies, these multinationals went for compulsory squeeze out. Cadbury was one of them. So their valuation was done by two firms, and it was offered to the shareholders. Some shareholders objected, and they went to the court. And somehow company agreed to appoint another valuer. So when company agreed to appoint another valuer, then another valuer did valuation after some gap, and they gave little higher value. Shareholders were not happy with that. And by that time, even regulation changed because RBI brought in DCF. So then some shareholders argued in the court that now DCF also has to be applied. So that another valuer which was appointed afterwards, court asked them to do the calculation again using the DCF. And in DCF is a time value of money. So from the original valuation, almost 2 years had passed. So DCF value came even higher than the earlier value which was given by the shareholders. And then that entire matter was in limbo, and there was no decision was taken. Then there is a judge called G.S. Patel in the Mumbai High Court. He finally cleared this particular case. And in his excellent judgment, if somebody wants to learn about the valuation, maybe Anup will cover this tomorrow, but I could not resist covering this because this judge has written excellently about what is the judicial review should be, what is the scope of the judge, in a valuation. Entire chapter in the judgment he has dedicated on the valuation principles. So I am just this highlighted question I am going to read. It says, I have found this submission singularly unappealing and unpersuasive. Another valuation is always possible. Change one assumption and the entire edifice of any valuation might well collapse. Change another and its facade may radically alter, showing a different picture altogether. This is not, as I understand it, the mandate of the law, nor the scope of the court's inquiry. Valuations are by definition inexact. They do not have invariable arithmetical precision. They are approximations, estimations, base judgment assessments. It is emphatically not for a court to substitute its own view for that of a valuer. It may accept reasons and within the well-defined boundaries of what is judicially permissible and what is not. Then in section 7 of that judgment, it talks about the general principles. It says, before a court can decline sanction to a scheme on account of a valuation, an objector to the scheme must first show that the valuation is ex facie unreasonable, that is so unreasonable that it cannot, on the face of it, be accepted. To upset a valuation, a wrong approach must be demonstrated clearly and unequivocally, and the result must be plainly invidious. A plausible rationale provided by a valuer is not to be readily disregarded merely because an objector has a different point of view. In considering an application for sanction, the court will ask itself at a minimum whether these tests are met. Is a fair and reasonable value being offered to the minority shareholders? Have the majority of the non-promoter shareholders voted in favor of the resolution? Can it be said on reading of a valuation as any fair-minded and reasonable person would do, and without macroscopic scrutiny, that the valuation is so egregiously wrong that the judicial conscience will not permit it? Has the valuer gone so far off track that the result of his valuation returns cannot but be wrong? The sanctioning court has no power or jurisdiction to exercise any appellate functions over the scheme. It is not a valuer. It does not have the necessary skills or expertise. It cannot substitute its own opinion for that of the shareholders. Its jurisdiction is peripheral and supervisory and not appellate. The court is not a carping critic, a hair-splitting expert, a meticulous accountant, or a fastidious counsel. The effort is not to emphasize the loopholes, technical mistakes, and accounting errors. Valuation is not an exact science. Far from it, it is always and only an estimation, a base judgment assessment. The fact that a particular estimation might not catch an objector's fancy is no ground to discredit it. All valuations proceed on assumptions. To disclose a valuation, it must be shown that those assumptions are such as could never have been made, and that they are so patently erroneous that the end result itself could not be but wrong, unfair and unreasonable. The court must not venture into the realm of convoluted analysis, extrapolation and taking on itself an accounting burden that is no part of its remit or expertise, and no part of a statutory obligation. It is possible to say which of several available valuation models are best or most appropriate. In a given case, the CCM method may be more accurate, in another the DCF model. There are yet others. No valuation is to be disregarded merely because it has used one or the other various methods. It must be shown that the chosen method of valuation is such as has resulted in an artificially depressed or contrived valuation well below what his fair-minded person may consider reasonable. So this is what observation he has made, and it's an excellent judgment. So whoever is interested can go through this entire judgment. So with this, I was told that I have to stop at 7 o'clock, and now it is 7 o'clock.
What is the citation?
It's a Cadbury judgment. You can just put it on Google, you'll get. It's the Bombay High Court judgment by Judge G.S. Patel.
Thank you, Parag, for your brilliant presentation. It won't be an exaggeration if I say that it was a discourse on valuation. He was so much involved, the participants were so much involved. It was truly brilliant, and the best part of your talk was that the questions which were raised from the floor, and there was so much of clarity of thought on the reply which you gave. That itself shows the authority which you have on the subject. Thank you very much once again for your presentation. Friends, as I said, Mr. Sujal Shah, who is another expert on valuation, he is also partner of Parag, and he is the one who has structured these programs. I would request Sujal to share his thoughts for 10-15 minutes.
Bhai, and good evening to all of you. We had conducted such course on valuation about 2 years back from the same forum, and we got a very good response. So Paras, when he took over last July, he was after me that we must design this kind of a course. And of course, with Vipul Bhai at the chair for this committee, I could not escape the sort of pressure from that, but we planned this course. Whatever lessons we learned from our last experience of holding such course 2 years back, and whatever remarks we got from the participants, we tried to sort of correct in this particular format. And that's why some of the aspects which we had not covered last time, mainly something to do with our overview of the technical valuation, this time we have added in as one of the sessions because many times questions were asked that okay, financial valuations are one of the aspects of overall valuation exercise. How these technical valuations are done. Technical valuations are typically done by chartered engineers who are well equipped to value say plant and machinery, buildings, sometimes even the land. So those aspects are covered this time. We also thought that it may be very important if we had one session from somebody who is working on real life acquisitions. When they acquire a company, what care they take while valuing as well as while acquiring those companies. So we have invited this time somebody from TCS, Mr. Neeraj Sanghvi, who will give us perspective about how the corporate world looks at when they acquire the company. So these were the two things which were newly added. Another aspect which was maybe not covered in a great amount of detail last time was various judicial announcements on valuation. So we have requested this time Mr. Anup Shah, who is going to be here tomorrow, to cover even those aspects specifically in terms of what are the various judgments related to valuations and what kind of call the judiciary has taken when a valuation was challenged. So apart from the documentation needs of a valuation, he is also going to cover this aspect as well. So to that extent, whatever we thought was required in terms of alteration for this kind of subject, we have tried to cover in this particular course. So that's on the theme of this thing. And I'm sure at the end of the 7 or 8 sessions which are planned, you will have a fair bit of sort of idea about how this work is carried out. Whether you are working in the industry or you are working in practice, I'm sure it is going to be of a great help. Coming to the subject per se, I'm sure in last about 3 hours, what Parag has taken you through the various important aspects related to valuation, you are now at least well versed with what kind of approach a valuer will take while valuing a company. So I am just covering some very few, principles relating to the valuations. First and foremost, whenever you do a valuation, there is always a cross-check possible to be done. So, suppose I am valuing a hotel company. If the value which I have arrived at, say enterprise value of that hotel company comes to X amount of crores, generally the hotel companies you will be able to correlate in terms of the number of keys. So suppose a hotel is say 200 keys, 200 rooms in short. If it comes to say 15 crores per room, if the market rate of the transactions which have taken place maybe in the recent past is say only 5 crores per room, then you need to look at your valuation whether we are completely off track. Are we too aggressive in valuing this hotel company? And as Parag mentioned, there could be some genuine reason why what you have arrived at for that hotel company has this kind of premium over the market. But once you do a valuation, you must do a cross check. Because every valuation has to have some kind of a sanity check in terms of whether it is meeting the market guidelines about that particular industry. Parag has given a number of examples on cement companies. So cement companies, their norm is anywhere between $150 to $175, correct? Nowadays, so $175 to $180 per ton of capacity. So if that is the norm at which various transactions in cement industry has taken place,
then at least you must cross-verify when you value a cement company, what's the range you are arriving at. So suppose my valuation throws a value of $200 per ton of capacity, let me have a re-look at that valuation and see what could be the reason. Am I too aggressive? Have I used a discount rate which is too conservative? Or have I applied a very high EBITDA multiple, that's why I am getting a very high value? Or there are some genuine reasons why my company is far better than other company because of the position of my plant. Maybe I am at a coastal area, I am able to export it, that's why I am enjoying a much better margin, and that's why my valuations are better than the industry average. So you will be able to cross it. Likewise for a service company, suppose I am valuing a BPO, and the norm for BPO company is say 25 lakhs per dollar of 25 lakhs per seat. In a BPO, the valuations are linked to the number of seats, typically when ultimately it gets reported. So you can check whether what you have worked out per seat basis, whether it matches the industry norms or not. Likewise for power companies, it is per megawatt of capacity. For a telecommunication company, it could be number of subscribers, linked to number of subscribers. So every industry has its norms. And where to get these kind of transaction details? There are a number of websites which throws this kind of details. It could be dealcurry.com or moneycontrol.com, BC Circle. There are a number of websites, and some of them are paid websites, some of them are free websites. So you can have a re-look at your valuation and cross-check it. This is called, I call it as a back of the envelope cross-check, whether I am arriving at a fair value or not. Because you may apply a number of methods, you may do best of the weightages. Ultimately what will sail through will be the reasonableness of the value which you arrive. Otherwise, you may give a very unreasonable value, your client will be very happy, but ultimately it should sail through in the eyes of the acquirer or the seller, or in the eyes of the regulator. Sometimes regulator may challenge your valuation, and if that time you don't have a proper logic that why your valuation is higher than the market norm, you may have a difficult time explaining to a regulator also. So one has to have this kind of a cross-check. Secondly, I think during the discussion I could see somebody asking why projections we write so much of disclaimer. So that time you need to keep in mind the code of conduct which our institute has also put on us. Those who are chartered accountants and holding certificate of practice, our institute code of conduct very clearly states that you cannot be a certified person for the projections. You can confirm the arithmetical accuracy, but you don't be a party to a projections. That's where you will find most of these reports which are issued where DCF is one of the methods of valuation. You will find a series of disclaimers given by the valuers, which will ultimately convey that you have tested the reasonableness for these projections, but you are not confirming that these results will be achieved. And nobody should invest based on this kind of projection.